Welcome to Darwin at the Movies. Today, I want to push a little further the idea, sketched out in episode 1 of Darwin at the Movies, that from an evolutionary perspective, movies should be thought of as scenario-building exercises. Their evolutionary value for their audience is in their ability to contribute to ways of thinking that could guide the viewer in dealing with fitness challenges. In the early goings in this series, I'm focusing upon romantic comedy as it is the most obviously transparent of scenario-building narratives, focusing as it does on the ultimate question of mating. If this idea of movies as scenario-building exercises is valid, then an obvious implication of this should be that we'd find romantic comedies directed more to males or females. Of course, filmmakers want as wide an audience for their films as possible, but males and females do not have identical fitness challenges. Therefore, a narrative directed distinctly toward one sex is going to have less appeal on average to the other sex. The scenario-building lessons will simply be less relevant. A dead giveaway of such a scenario-building strategy is a rom-com that males call a chick flick or that females consider crude. Though, of course, the astute member of either sex may be well advised to pay close attention to the scenario-building narratives directed towards the opposite sex, but that's another matter. Movies can certainly try to appeal to both sexes through each of the main characters, but privileging one perspective over the other is a common enough form of scenario building, and, as you'd expect in such a case, the scenario building and its lessons would be expected to highlight fitness lessons most relevant to the sex's perspective that's being privileged. I want to illustrate this by looking at two films, both released the same year in 1985. These two films tell remarkably similar stories, though from the perspectives of the different sexes. The films I have in mind are Into the Night and Desperately Seeking Susan. One could quibble about how precisely they fit into the genre parameters, but they're close enough for our purposes. In both stories, the central protagonists, in a wrong partner marriage, are driven by a psychological condition, insomnia and amnesia respectively, into a brief, in both cases it seems to be about 36 hours, adventure exploration of a strange urban landscape populated by various oddball characters, while pursued by people threatening violence against them to get something that they have, leading the protagonists to challenge their perception of who they are and what they really value. The resolution leads them to eventually wind up with their right partner. Also, somewhat amusing, these near mirror image stories released the same year also featured in supporting roles two of the top pop stars of the era, Madonna in Desperately Seeking Susan and David Bowie in Into the Night. Into the Night, in fact, is full of fascinating cameos, mostly of other directors, but that curio is tangential to our point here. In both movies, the main protagonist is living an uninspiring, bland life. This is aggravated by a wrong partner with who they lack the kind of romantic connection the protagonists are seeking, and in both cases, the wrong partner spouses are in fact cheating on them. Their psychological burden, the insomnia or amnesia, seem to serve as symbolic stand-ins for their broken emotional lives. Meeting the right partner, who they wind up with in the end, resolves their psychological condition. There are, though, some interesting differences in the details of these two resolutions. Before we tease out these differences, though, let's review some basic evolutionary psychology of mating. The scholarly literature emphasizes that both males and females have both short and long-term mating strategies. In short-term strategies, males are just looking to have sex, while in long-term strategies, they're looking to be fathers. A variety of things can determine which strategy a male pursues, including the prevailing ecological conditions as well as his own mating market mate value. Males who are in higher demand on the mating market tend to be able to more successfully pursue short-term strategies, providing them many more offspring producing opportunities than they would have staying committed to a single female. Of course, survival and thriving of the offspring is important too. Males in more stable ecological conditions can find long-term mating strategies more effective for ensuring the survival and thriving of their offspring. In both cases, males tend to prefer females who are physically attractive, suggesting good genes, and young, suggesting high fertility and even possibly higher reproductive value. Control over resources is not important to men on average, but there are different personality traits preferred in long-term as opposed to short-term strategies. In long-term mating, males prefer females who are kinder, smarter, and show signs of reliable fidelity. Though there's been some controversy over this, it appears still that there remains a sharper divide in short and long-term mating strategies for females. The qualities sought in male mates are more distinctive. For long-term mating, females are generally seeking fathers for their children, in which case they likewise prefer kinder, smarter men who show signs of reliable fidelity. For long-term mating, though, females are also looking for control over resources, though valuable cues to the capacity to gain control over resources in the form of high social status, expressed either as social prestige or social dominance, can be just as important. Though it's worth mentioning here parenthetically, when we talk about dominance, we're not necessarily talking about the dominance the man would express over the woman, though that may be sought in some cases, but generally what we're talking about here is men that show the capacity to exercise dominance over other men. For short-term mating strategies, which appear to exhibit themselves more commonly during ovulation, the kinder, smarter, more reliably faithful traits are much less important, as the females do not appear to be seeking a father, but possibly just better quality genes. If a female, after all, can get the genes of a very high mating market value male into her sons, she'll be doing a very good job of improving her own genes' fitness, since more higher quality females will be attracted to her son. It seems that the temptation to cheat on an established partner is greater for women when ovulating, and especially when their regular partner is of lower mating market value. So, with these insights from the scholarship in mind, let's look a little more closely at the scenarios offered for each of the sexes in these two almost mirror image movies. In Desperately Seeking Susan, Roberta, Roseanne Arquette's character, dissatisfied with her husband, and having described herself as desperate, which she says is a romantic quality, winds up via her voyeuristic interest in a couple that communicate through the want ads, it is 1985, remember, and directly resulting amnesia becomes involved with the more charming and handsome Des, played by Aidan Quinn. Interestingly, at first blush, it might be assumed that Des is more chivalrous and ardent in his pursuit, but this isn't really true. Roberta's husband, in fact, pursues her right up to the very end of the movie. He has no shortage of resources, owning his own company, and though his somewhat tasteless commercials suggest his marital unreliability, there's no textual evidence in the film that Roberta knows of his infidelity. Des, on the other hand, seems to work as a sort of bohemian, somewhat beleaguered projectionist at some art house movie theater. The real difference between the men seems to be that Des is more charming, handsome, and just cooler, hipper. That is, Roberta seems to be engaging here in short-term mating strategy. She's behaving like a woman with a less desirable mating value market mate while she's ovulating. Her amnesia, in fact, may be thought of as symbolizing her ovulation. In fact, it's Des's intervention that directly leads to Roberta's amnesia/ovulation. The tragedy version of such a story would have the female character, once her ovulation is over, crawling back in shame to her husband. However, this is a comedy, so happy endings are the menu du jour. After her amnesia and symbolic ovulation are over, she realizes she belongs with the hotter Des. It is as though the scenario-building function of the story is to teach women that the bolder sexual experience of ovulation is an opportunity for moving themselves up in the mating market world. That the movie should have as a key supporting player Madonna, who by this time has already established her brand as a sexually self-determining and self-realizing woman, only serves to reinforce this scenario-building narrative in the story. In Into the Night, Jeff Goldblum's Ed also finds himself in a dreary, passionless marriage and job, though unlike Roberta, he not only knows about his spouse's infidelity, but it is catching them in the act that sends him off on the adventure that finally leads him to Michelle Pfeiffer's Diana. Unlike Roberta, in Desperately though, who is on a fast mating strategy, which happily ends up in the promise of a slow one, Ed is exercising a slow mating strategy all along. This is not a midlife crisis story of a man out to take one last run at enhancing his fitness. Ed is very much guided along a slow mating strategy, but he's just not with the right person to realize that strategy. This is clearly indicated by Ed's attitude to Diana from the very start. Clearly, he wants to be charitable, even chivalrous. Our and Ed's early impression of Diana, though, is that she's something of an adventuress, promiscuous, and likely a gold digger. Such a woman is not a promising long-term mating prospect, though she could be very appealing for a man pursuing a short-term mating strategy. But Ed is not, and from the very beginning, while he does want to help her, he is constantly looking to remove himself from the situation. Probably a half dozen times, or maybe more, over the first 90 minutes of the movie, he considers himself to have done his good deed and that it's time for him to go home and get some sleep. But either Diana pleads with him to stand by her until she makes the next necessary connection to solve her problem — people are, after all, trying to kill her — or some exogenous circumstance makes it apparent that she still needs his help. During the course of their adventure, though, Ed comes to realize that there's more to Diana than first impressions had suggested. It turns out, far from the flighty party girl she'd first seemed, for several years she'd been in an emotionally serious, maybe even you could say a committed relationship. And that relationship is only coming to an end because her partner in it is in his final days of a terminal illness. It's true that this ill partner of Diana has a wife, but it's hardly even like she's an adulteress, since her partner and his wife had been alienated and living apart for many years by the time she met him and started the relationship. Along the way, Ed has discovered that Diana is a much more promising long-term mating strategy than it seemed to be the case at the start. The tide turns around the three-quarter mark of the movie when Ed, rather than finally taking the opportunity to flee her, which he has been angling for up to that point, actually acts upon a concern for her safety and decides not to leave, but to go find her. That choice leads to multiple occasions in the final quarter of the film in which he risks his own life to help her. And the symbolic shift in their relationship is revealed as on several occasions around this time of the movie they actually introduce each other as their spouses. Ed's insomnia might be thought of as symbolic of him sleepwalking through his life in a passionless marriage and a dead-end job. When finally he realizes he's made a connection with Diana, a passionate woman who is a genuine long-term mating prospect, despite first impressions, he's at last able to sleep. We're never told how long he sleeps, but by his reaction, it seems to have been a long time. The film teases at the end with the prospect that Diana may have just been the self-serving, flighty party girl that she initially seemed, But again, this is not a tragedy, but a comedy. And when he's ready to go, she's there ready to go with him, asking if she can get a ride to the airport, which in the context of the film is a pretty good last line. We could take just a moment to compare Ed's story with a similar one, weirdly also released in 1985. There was something about the zeitgeist then, I guess, in After Hours, where Paul enters into a similar overnight adventure, but with very much a fast mating strategy in play. And as it happens, in After Hours, Paul's actually pursuing Roseanne Arquette, who Roberta from Desperately Seeking Susan, in his fast mating strategy. Things turn out, though, not nearly as well for Paul as they do for Ed, so maybe that's supposed to be a lesson from the cinematic scenario builders about the relevant merits of male mating strategies appropriate for the mid-1980s amid a more conservative Reagan's America with its throwback sentiments to the 1950s. That's purely speculative, but the contrast between Ed's slow and Paul's fast mating strategy is quite striking, as well as the rather different outcomes that they achieve. Also interesting is the contrast with Roberta's fast strategy, which somehow magically turns into a successful slow strategy. But this is not a particularly new theme in female-directed narratives. It is in fact the classic story of the Harlequin romance, in which the woman is drawn to a handsome, high-dominance male, the kind usually more free and inclined to pursue a fast mating strategy, who she eventually wins over to romantic commitment and domestic union. But the main point we were exploring here is that since movies are scenario-building exercises valued for their insight into fitness challenges, even when movies are near mere images of each other, like Into the Night and Desperately Seeking Susan, if their narrative perspective focuses on different sexes, we'd expect to see different mating strategies played out. Hopefully, these analyses help to better understand how movies can act as we called it in the introduction to this series, fossils of the mind. We will apply these insights looking at some classic romantic comedy films next week, when once again we take Darwin to the movies.